All right, here we go. So soil fertility for flax. So this is kind of a bright spot in production. I hope you appreciate it. It's one of those things that makes flax more profitable, perhaps. So it's a very ancient crop, if this hasn't been mentioned already. Probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 6,000 years old. There are kind of parallel references to it in very ancient Egypt and ancient Samaria. And there was trade in between those two civilizations over on the Euphrates, Tigris rivers and over on the Nile. But and that's a depiction. The one on the top is a depiction of the flax harvest. The guy over on the right, leaning on his crutch, that's the person in the tomb where this painting was made, and that's his family cutting the flax. And so they oftentimes they'll pull it out of the ground, and I think you see some of that in the picture. They'll just pull it out of the ground, and then maybe cut off the roots from there. The seed was also used. Linseed oil was common back then, and so they would stack it, and then they would wrap it. And then in the bottom picture is another cave painting, and this is the linen side of things, getting it prepared for linen. They would put it in water to dissolve some of the pectins and some of the binding agents, and then that person on the lower left-hand corner, I think that's called stripling, where they're beating the flax on that corrugated type tool, whatever it is, and it separates the fibers. But linen and wheat were the two great exports of Egypt all the way through Roman times. So this has been around for a very long time. And when we look at the salt tolerance, I think it has a great to do. It's really instructive to look back at the origin of crops and what some of the limitations are to them today. And flax is no exception. It was grown in that fertile crescent where the salts were low at that time. They're high now, but at that time they were very low. And Nile certainly would flood every year, and so it'd leach all the salts out. And so flax has a really low salt tolerance. So you should kind of look for the same fields to put flax in that you would if you were raising dry edible beans. And maybe this is one of the limitations to our yield, is people really don't realize that and figure it's been grown in North Dakota for decades, that maybe it's as salt tolerant as wheat, and it is not. So select your fields wisely. And if you have a field that has some areas that are higher in salts, put them in barley, put them in oats, put them in something else, and then put the flax and the good stuff. And I think your field yield will go way up. So that's something you really need to keep in mind. Once you get over the threshold salinity about 0.5, which is pretty low, you're looking at some major yield reductions. Once you get up to an EC of 1, you're looking at 25% of what you might do. So if the potential was 40 bushels based on the environment, the most you're going to get, even if the environment is the same, would be maybe 30 bushels or so. So when you're penciling things out, keep this in mind. So I'll move on to nitrogen. The nitrogen is important, of course, as all of our non-legume crops are. But the rates are fairly low compared to other crops, and it's a major concern not to overply. One of my first experiences with flax is running around near the Langdon area, and before we had new recommendations, and the flax was generally laid down, and that's because people just had a tendency to overapply based on the old archaic yield goal concept. So you don't want to try to push the yield by pushing the nitrogen rate. It just won't work. So this is some work, and I think it's some of it that let's see, so I can see what's going on here. All right, so this is the work that Greg Endis was talking about before, and he was talking about the nitrogen. And in 3 out of the 4 years, this This is Carrington in 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003. So only one out of those 4 years they had a response to nitrogen. The residual N before planting was in the neighborhood of 30 pounds in the top 2 feet to 50 pounds in the top 2 feet. And so these are the applied rates here, 60, 90, 120. So this is, you know, somewhere around 90, 120, 150 at the lowest and upward from there. So no response, no response. I mean, it looks like there's a response, but there must have been incredible variability in that plot. No response here, and then no response in the fourth year. And generally, the yield increase was somewhere around that 25 bushels an acre, which would be somewhere between that 60 and 90 applied. And then this is Langdon in 2001 to 2003. And in 1 year, they had a response again to nitrogen, and that was around that 90 pounds of applied N, something like that. So it's not a huge user of N. If these were wheat plots or corn plots or something like that, the yield response would continue up until probably after that 120 pounds of N and not before. And it would be very consistent and not just 1 out of 3 years or 1 out of 4. So it's a different animal, and treat it like it is. So our recommendations, based on all the studies that have been done recently and in the past, 80 pounds of N per acre. It's not yield goal sensitive. Environment is going to make your yield. You want to make sure that the nitrogen is in place. And the environment is going to do the rest. Subtract your residual nitrate to 2 feet in depth, less previous crop credits. Some of you that are long-term no-till are wondering what to do about that. And I think if you wanted to shave 10, 20 pounds of N off of that, I think you certainly could. And then also those of you that are in the Langdon area that know where that is, that shaly soil area in a triangle north of Devil's Lake through Langdon is, you know, you could probably shave the N a little bit from there. But unless this nitrate test was really high, I would always put a little bit of N in there, because if you don't, any potential mineralization is probably very slow. There has to be enough nitrogen there to stimulate the bacteria and whatever else is degrading residue and organic matter to release the nitrogen. It's called the priming effect. And so there has to be a little bit of nitrogen there. So applying a little bit of nitrogen is okay. So one of the things that you might consider is that if you're using a pre, use 28 as a carrier, perhaps. It makes a nice carrier for herbicides, and so, you know, 10 gallon of 28 is 30 pounds of N, so you can go with that. If you need less than that, you can always make up the rest with water to make sure that you have enough carrier to get a good spread, a good spray of the herbicide across it. So phosphate in flax. We don't recommend any phosphate fertilizer to flax. The flax is very mycorrhizal dependent. Barry made a point of Kaylee Gash's work with the arbuscular mycorrhiza fungi, and that's the AMF. I don't think it has anything to do with bowling balls. Aren't they AMF? I think so. Anyway, but there's a picture on the left from a colleague that used to be at University of Manitoba with the arbuscles. These little blobs here. Those are kind of like the central nervous system, the little colony of fungi. They make that little hub there, and then these are the hyphae. These are really what really makes the symbiosis work. They infect the plant, but unlike a pathogen, they just don't take and never give unless it's a toxin. They take, but then also they send out these hyphae out into the soil, and the amount of soil that they explore is many times what the roots themselves will explore. And so they're highly efficient at taking up phosphate, which doesn't move very much in the soil, and they're pretty efficient in taking up zinc, which is kind of a curiosity that flax is one of the crops that responds to zinc. But anyway, particularly phosphate. Picture on the right is where there's really, really, really low mycorrhizal infection, if not zero. So that's what happens if you put on phosphate fertilizer. It's a trade-off. It's kind of like putting nitrogen on a soybean. that, yeah, you can put on nitrogen in the soybean, but then it doesn't support the nodulation. If you put phosphate on flax, it doesn't support the mycorrhiza. So there's this feedback mechanism between the plant and the fungus. So it's just a waste of money. It's not that the soil test won't go down, although you won't be able to see it. It'll be such a small amount, even if your yields of flax are good, that you won't even see it in the soil test. But you know, we're kind of year to year, most of us, most farmers, and so if phosphate, especially at the prices it is right now, aren't really going to help your bottom line, then don't put it on. So we don't recommend any phosphate with flax. You don't put any fertilizer with the seed, anything like that. It's not profitable at any soil test value, even if it's like 2 part per million. It's still not going to pay you to put phosphate on. The mycorrhiza will do it for you. So speaking of that, and this is some work from Manitoba, and this is flax after canola and flax after wheat. And so when they put 0 phosphate on, here the yields are 24.9, 25.1. There's no difference, there's no difference, there's no difference, there's no difference. So they found the same thing up at Manitoba that we found down here in North Dakota. And I don't know if they still recommend phosphate on their flax or not. Sometimes people put that in the recommendation just to cover their tracks, so to speak. But I don't see the need for that. It's not profitable, don't do it. The reason we're putting on fertilizer is to make money. If you're not making money, don't do it. The other thing about this is, talked about mycorrhiza, canola is not mycorrhizal supportive. So if you go flax after canola compared to flax after wheat, here we lost a couple bushels, here we lost 3 bushels at this site, but then at this site they lost 5 bushels, 5.5 bushels, and I think you saw that in the previous slide, where the flax is not going to do very well if you put it behind a crop that's not supporting mycorrhiza. And this would go with prevent plant too, if you just treated your prevent plant like an old fallow used to, you know, disc it up or run some kind of machine over it, and you really didn't have anything growing on it all year. There's not going to be much mycorrhiza left, and so that would not be a place where you'd want to put flax. If you put some rye or oats or barley or something like in there, and mixed it in with some, you know, didn't have to, but if it's just a straight grass, then there should be mycorrhiza there, and that should be okay. If you just put, and I think this is rare, but there could be some people that put just radish out in their prevent plant. That's not mycorrhizal supportive either, and so you don't want to put it on a prevent plant that just had a brassica on it. That won't work. So keep that in mind as well. Also, your prevent plant nitrogen, residual nitrogen, could be very high, and so you have to consider that as well. You don't want your flax to go down. This is a summary of some P-rate trials. Zabriskie, who taught soils and was here back in the 50s and 60s, he did a whole series of tests with phosphate, and I still have some of his files, but he didn't get a yield increase with phosphate at all. It's kind of a mystery that that NDSU had ever recommended phosphate on flax. I think people just did it because wheat was responsive, and so, you know, maybe they're doing something wrong in their field research, but it was just so consistent over time, over the decades, that there wasn't any response to phosphate. It's just silly not to use 0. And this is some work up in Canada, where a lot of sites, what is that, 15 sites in various low to high P levels, and even at the very low sites, no response to phosphate. So it's just not us, it's everybody that's done this research, apparently. So with the nitrogen and with no phosphate with it, I mean, there really isn't any reason to put any kind of NPK fertilizer with the seed, but just in case somebody thinks I'm crazy and wants to do it anyway for goodness knows what reason, this is a chart of what the limits would be before your stand really starts to suffer. And so with a disc, this is the area that you're in. Pull opener, sweep. I think Greg's going to have these presentations. They're all recorded, so you can go back and take a look at this instead of feverishly writing it down while I'm going through it. But the rates of N plus K2O, and that's what it is, are relatively small, especially with a disc, and more if you have a sweep. But there's not that many people that have a sweep anymore. But again, there's really no reason to do it since you're not putting on phosphate anyway. So these are the nitrogen and potassium nutrient recommendations for flax. It's very rare, I think, in flax growing areas for us to have low potassium, soil test potassium levels. Don't use a percent of potassium from the base exchange, because that's an extremely poor way to recommend potassium. If you have greater than 120 ppm of K in the soil from the soil test, you really don't need to worry about it. That 10 pounds, I don't know, maybe that's crop removal, but you really don't need it. So 120 20 ppm of K2 of K in your soil test, and then maybe some K, but that would be broadcast with the nitrogen that you're applying. I mentioned it before, flax is one of the only 4 crops we have in the state where there's been any record of any kind of yield increase with zinc application, and the other 3 are corn and potatoes and dry edible beans, but not soybeans, peas, chickpeas, all of that, very specific. So if you have a soil test with the DDPA extract, which is the one that we use at the university and AgVice and soil testing labs that I'm aware of that use North Central recommendations, that you have 1 part per million or more, then you're okay and you don't have to worry about it. If you have less than that, then putting about a pint to a quart of any kind of zinc chelate with water, not fertilizer, but just with water, is going to be sufficient, and you're not going to hurt the stand if you do that, and that's going to be plenty of zinc. The condition of zinc deficiency, the deficiency symptoms, that's a picture, an old picture, probably almost 40 years old, from John Morgan, who retired and passed away here a few years ago at NDSU. It's called the candelabra effect, where the tops turn chlorotic and then there's side branches that come out. The yield is depressed, the height of the plant is depressed, and I'll show you that in a minute here. Yeah, here's the first recorded reference in North Dakota of chlorotic dieback. Dr. Flores didn't know what was causing it, but he wrote a little paper about it in North Dakota Farm Research. This is on campus. Those of you that aren't very old, take a look at this wooden trestle that's over the railroad yard. I don't know why anybody could be brave enough to go across that thing, but that's what used to be there before the new overpass. But anyway, this is what chlorotic dieback looks like. That's what zinc deficiency looks like. Really, really stunted plants. Here, the rest of the field's flowering, and this is just struggling. Maybe you find one here or there, but really low. And this is what it looks like in the early stages. This is a picture from the Canadians, where the chlorosis is up on top, and the top apical dominance is suppressed, and then it starts to branch out from there, and the yield is low, and the stand isn't reduced, but the height of the plant is certainly less. So let's see. So that's my last slide of my prepared presentation. But looking at things, it said soil management. So I just wanted to say something about soil management. If it's at all possible to just stick the seed in the ground this year, that would be a really, really excellent thing to do. The minute you put a field cultivator, vertical tillage, anything in the ground's going to dry up to the depth of where you place the seeds. I think with this, even though the soils are really almost dust dry, the soil is never zero water. There's always some water around the clay and the sand particles. And so what's happening with the with the warmer temperatures in the day and the freezes at night, is that top of that soil is going to be really friable going into planting season. And I challenge you to go out there and just see for yourself. Well, once it thaws out a little bit, and you can actually get your hand in there, that soil is going to be very pliable. It's not going to be chunky. It's not going to be cloddy. It's going to be really, and it's going to be pretty fit to plant. And so if your planter is tooled up enough to just go in and put the seed in the ground, that's going to be your friend. It'll make you, it'll be like a half-inch rain or more. And so as little tillage as possible to get that crop in the ground is going to save you moisture and make you yield toward the end. So I want you to consider that as you get close to planting. And with that, I think that's it. This is a summary. Nitrogen rates are conservative, 80 pounds nitrogen, less credits, no phosphate, potassium application limited to soils with potassium test less than 120, and modest zinc chelate rates with or near the seed at planting if the soil test zinc is less than 1 ppm.